I was 13 when it happened, not a student, not even supposed to be on school grounds, but that summer, my mother had taken a janitorial job at Belgrave night shifts. I would wait for her in the storage room behind the library, curled up on a pile of donation books, pretending not to hear her cough or curse or cry. One night, she left me sleeping in the break room while she cleaned the lower gym wing. She didn't come back. They said it was an accident, slipped, hit her head, drowned in the shallow training pool. But I knew that wasn't true, because I woke up to her voice screaming, and when I ran to find her, I saw him, Leonard, kneeling over her body, not helping, not panicked, just staring. Then he turned to me calm as a priest and said, "You shouldn't be here. They paid me not to speak, or rather, they paid someone else, my aunt. She was given a lump sum in compassion, a relocation offer, and a thick folder marked non-disclosure agreement, and they made the story disappear. No autopsy, no charges, no obituary. My mother vanished from the record like a smudge wiped off a lens, but I remembered, when I returned to Belgrave years later, not as a student, but as their quietest librarian. Nobody recognized me, not even Leonard, especially not Leonard, but I remembered. Now I had the files, the internal communications, the injury report that had been backdated, the resignation letter of the pool supervisor and signed, and the grainy surveillance photo of a man in uniform standing too close to a woman who clearly wanted space. It wasn't enough for the police, but it would be enough for them, the press, the students, the world that had never looked into Belgrave's basement. I took the packet, sealed it in a brown envelope, no signature, no message, just one word written on the front, "Ray open." Then, I mailed it to 3 places: the local newspaper that had once been banned from campus, the alumni network that still whispered about the pool incident, and Leonard's own wife. Let the world dig, let the water drain, and let him drown in the truth he buried beneath polished floors and polished lies. I returned to the library that night not as the watcher, but as the reckoner. There comes a moment, not of noise, but of stillness, when the walls that held the lies begin to tremble, not with fury, but with truth. By Monday morning, the envelope had arrived. 3, in fact, the paper ran the headline in bold, "What Lies Beneath Belgrave." 13 years of silence. The alumni network exploded, dozens of former students sharing stories, screenshots, uneasy memories that had long been pushed aside in favor of prestige and polish. And at 7:42 a.m., Leonard's wife left the house with a single suitcase and a look of quiet devastation. I watched from the shadows of the East Wing corridor, book card in hand, like always. But that day, I wasn't shelving anything. That day, I was listening, and what I heard was change. The students had already begun their protest. No signs, no slogans, just silence. Hundreds of them, seated cross-legged on the quad, books in their laps, pages open. It was the most powerful sound I'd ever heard, and the most devastating to a man like Leonard, because silence, when it is chosen, is no longer a prison. It's a weapon. At noon, the council reconvened. No excuses were accepted this time, no denials. Leonard tried once, his voice trembling behind the microphone. "You're letting one woman's trauma destroy everything we've built." And that's when I stood up. I walked into that room not as a librarian, but as a daughter. As a witness, and as a woman who had bled in silence for half her life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I looked at him, and I said, "You didn't build Belgrave. You buried it under concrete and fear, and the bodies of those who didn't fight back. I was one of them, but not anymore. You mistook silence for obedience, but it was never that. It was strategy. And now your time is over." He didn't reply. He simply left. Not in handcuffs, not in screams, just a man collapsing under the weight of his own mask. The council voted to open a full investigation. Belgrave issued a public apology. The pool was permanently closed and renamed after my mother. And, as for me, I left, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer needed to stay. You see, revenge is not about destruction. True revenge, the kind that heals, is about reclaiming truth, reclaiming voice, reclaiming peace. I took a job in a small town library. Quiet, wooden shelves, the kind where people still leave handwritten notes in the margins, and every once in a while, a student walks in, nervous, lonely, full of questions, and I smile and hand them a book, because I know what it means to be unheard, and I know how dangerous That silence can be until someone decides to listen. Silence can be a wound or a weapon. What defines us is not how loudly we shout, but how deeply we choose to stand when no one else will. Sometimes the quietest girl in the room is not the weakest. She's just waiting. And one day, she will rise and rewrite the story. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I feared what would come next, but because the game had changed, and I wasn't the only one moving pieces across the board anymore. The number burned in my memory like a scar, 7 digits, nothing more. Yet they pulls beneath my skin with the weight of something inevitable. I called it from a payphone near the train station, not from my flat, not from school, because this wasn't a conversation I wanted connected to walls that might be listening. 3 rings, then silence, then a voice unfiltered, male, mid-30s perhaps. Calm, too calm. You're late, he said. I didn't realize we set an appointment, I answered. He chuckled softly. No amusement in it. You always were precise. Even back then. A pause. I stayed quiet, and then he said it. Ava Marin. I said nothing. Silence is its own language. He took it as permission. I've been watching you. Not in the creepy way, don't worry. More professionally. What do you want? I asked. You already know, he replied. I want in. Into what? Whatever it is you're building. Because let's be honest, Ava, this isn't about the book anymore. It hasn't been for a long time, has it? He wasn't wrong. The manuscript was only the beginning. A key that opened a far darker corridor. But his certainty irritated me. Not because he was arrogant, but because he spoke like someone who had read a chapter ahead. I hated being caught behind. Why the chess piece? I asked. Another soft laugh. Because I've been played like one, but not anymore. You're not the only one Leonard tried to erase. My breath stilled. He continued. My sister, Ava. Her name was Camille. She was 17 when she filed a complaint against one of the donors. Kroll shut it down. Said she was unstable. A week later, she was gone. Transferred. Officially and unofficially, she's dead. I closed my eyes, not out of shock, but because I'd heard this tune before, in different keys, different names, Camille, Nina, and me, all silenced, one way or another. How do I know you're not lying? I asked. You don't, he said, but I'm offering you something better than truth. I waited. Access. He explained it simply. He was a freelance penetration tester paid to break into systems, test security, map vulnerabilities. 3 years ago, Kroll had hired him to clean up a breach involving sensitive faculty files, and in doing so, he'd made copies, not out of malice. Not yet. Out of instinct. Out of knowing even then, that men like Leonard don't hire people like him, unless something darker is leaking through the cracks. He had emails, audio, proof of money transfers, digital records of settlements, private correspondence between Leonard and trustees. I'll give them to you, he said. All of it, on one condition. What? I want it to burn. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't asking for money, or fame, or mercy. He wanted what I wanted. To unravel the polished lie. To make the silence scream. To watch the man who built his kingdom on other people's bones crumble beneath the truth. I gave him a location. A dead drop inside a hollowed-out dictionary in the library's discarded text bin. We would not meet. We would not call again. One drop. One time, he agreed. Before he hung up, he said one last thing. I thought you were dead, Ava. I almost smiled. So did he. Click. That night, I returned to the library. The storm had arrived. Early rain hammering the stained glass windows like 1,000 fists begging to be let in. I sat at my desk, lit a single lamp, and opened the notebook again. This time, I didn't write names. I wrote numbers, bank accounts, timestamps, logins. The night had given me a key, and tomorrow, I would open the vault, because now, I wasn't alone in the dark. And this time, silence would not protect them. It would indict them. Some people think the truth is buried, but the truth isn't 6 feet under. It's sitting in someone's inbox. It's stored in a cloud. It's labeled confidential and buried beneath 30 folders. It's there, waiting for someone to open the right door. The vault wasn't a place. It was a server, a section of Belgrave's digital architecture marked only as Legacy Archive G3, accessible only by senior board members and Leonard himself. Buried behind encrypted keys, biometric checkpoints, and strings of code so dense it looked like a language not meant for human eyes. But the night had drawn a map, a blueprint of corruption, line by line, and now, with every keystroke, I wasn't just hacking a system, I was unsealing years of silence. At 3:13 a.m., in the heart of the library, where only the walls could hear, I bypassed the final lock. The screen blinked, access granted. Inside was everything: audio recordings of meetings where reports were rephrased before filing, settlement agreements with student families bribed into silence, expulsion memos rewritten 3 times until the reason disappeared, and above all, a video.it was dated November 4, 2020. File name: Camille Testimony. MP4. I hesitated, then clicked. The screen faded into a dimly lit room. A girl sat alone, 17, maybe younger, pale, shoulders tight, eyes wide but distant. A single question was asked off camera: "Tell us what happened." And she did. In shaking voice, between pauses, she told everything: the assault, the threats, the silence forced onto her. She named him. She named Leonard. And at the end, she whispered, "If I disappear, please, please don't forget me." I watched the whole thing, then I watched it again, not to understand her pain, I already did, but to feel the weight of it, to let it live in my blood. I downloaded the file, and for the first time in 7 years, I clicked send. The email was anonymous. The recipients, a curated list: 2 investigative journalists, 1 former Belgrave board member who had resigned without a word, and 1 woman, Marla Gray, the current vice chair of Belgrave Academy, and the only person still inside the system with a documented vote against Leonard's promotion to headmaster. I'd read her file. She had a daughter, now grown, a teacher herself, and in a memo from years ago, she once wrote, "A school that chooses reputation over its children does not deserve either." That was enough for me. I didn't write a message. I didn't sign a name. I only attached the file. And in the subject line, she asked not to be forgotten. The storm broke that night, not in the sky, but in inboxes, and by morning, the gates of Belgrave would begin to shake. They say revolutions begin with whispers, but this one started with a file, a single video, sent in silence, detonated like thunder inside a marble boardroom that had long convinced itself it was untouchable. I didn't attend the emergency council meeting, of course not, but I watched, from the silent cameras embedded in the library archive, ones Leonard himself had installed years ago to monitor student behavior. What he didn't know was that those same feeds had quietly fed into the internal network. And with a little digital guidance from the night, I now had front row seats. The meeting began with thin smiles and strained greetings. Then Marla Gray stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply placed a USB on the table and said, "Watch it. All of it. Then we'll talk about integrity." Some of them did, right there. Others refused. They folded arms, scoffed. One of them, the finance chair, a man named Richter, said the footage was obviously doctored. Marla turned to him and asked, "Why do you sound like someone who's seen something like this before?" He went silent, and in that pause, the room shifted, not all at once, but like ice cracking underfoot. Leonard, for the first time in any recorded meeting, raised his voice. "This is a coordinated attack by someone within this institution. I will not have my legacy defamed by anonymous lies." But it wasn't rage in his voice. It was fear, and everyone heard it. The vote followed. To suspend Leonard pending investigation. The room split, 4 yes, 4 no, 1 abstained, deadlocked, until Marla turned to the youngest member, the newest appointee, a woman named Sienna Voss, who had barely spoken all year. "Sienna," Marla said, "you have the deciding vote." Sienna looked down, then up, her voice barely above a whisper. "We ask our students to speak the truth, even when it's hard. Why should we be any different?" She voted yes. Leonard was suspended that evening, not fired. Not yet, but the gate cracked, and I had the next stone ready. Back in the archive room, I opened a folder I'd kept hidden even from the night, labeled simply, "Beneath the Pool." Inside were records from 13 years ago, before I ever set foot in Belgrave, before Leonard became headmaster, before I was even Ava the librarian. I wasn't planning to use them, but now, the game had changed, and if Leonard wanted to play dirty, I would show him what I'd buried. Every institution has a place it pretends doesn't exist. At Belgrave, that place was the pool, or rather what was beneath it. 13 years ago, the academy closed the original indoor pool for renovation. A structural crack, they claimed. Water damage. But those of us who lived nearby heard rumors about what really happened, that a student had drowned, that the head coach was quietly dismissed, that the police were called, and then silence. That night, I returned to the archive. I pulled out the master file. I compiled the Belgrave dossier. I called it now, though the folder bore no label. It was thick with evidence, emails, complaints, surveillance stills, audio snippets captured through forgotten intercom systems. But tonight, I added something new. Names of those who had turned away, who knew and stayed silent, who accepted promotions in exchange for looking elsewhere. I was done being the only one who carried the weight of this truth. If they wanted to whisper behind my back, then they should be ready to scream when I turned to face them. And as I sealed the folder again, I wrote one more name on the list. In bold, inked letters, Leonard Kroll, architect of silence. Because the staff room had spoken, the web was tightening, and the one man who thought he'd buried me alive was about to learn what grows in the dark. Not every war begins with gunfire. Some begin with silence being broken in just the right place, at just the right time, with just the right word. My war began on a Tuesday. The school woke up as usual. Belgrave glittered under winter light, clean hallways, polished floors, the scent of citrus disinfectant masking years of rot. Students moved in clusters. Teachers carried coffee and indifference. Leonard Kroll descended from his office at 8:10 a.m. sharp, his gait a study in curated authority. But that day, something waited for him. On every table in the teacher's lounge, someone had placed a single envelope. No stamp, no logo, just the words, "Before you speak of silence, ask who taught her not to scream." Inside was a photocopy. It wasn't dramatic. No blood, no threats, just a printed email. The one Leonard wrote in 2016. Will proceed with my name only. She's unstable, emotional. I've kept the drafts as proof of development under my guidance. She won't contest. I know how to handle her. No context, no sender, no explanation, just those words, raw and unfiltered, and below them, a single signature, L. Crowlby, 9:00 a.m. The school buzzed with tension that no one could name aloud. No one claimed to have seen who left the envelopes. The CCTV system mysteriously glitched that morning. 20 minutes of static. Mrs. Whitmore didn't speak. Mr. Harrow fidgeted all day. The head of security walked the halls twice as often, but with no destination. And Leonard? Leonard locked his office door for 3 hours straight. He called a closed meeting with the board, sent out a campus-wide memo about anonymous harassment, tried to recenter the narrative, tried to look unbothered. But I saw the way he touched his collar, how he cleared his throat too often, how, for the first time, he looked behind him when walking down the corridor. Good, let him taste uncertainty. Meanwhile, in the library, I rearranged nothing. Books remained where they were. Students whispered as usual. The lights flickered once, just once, and then settled into quiet obedience. But within me, something ancient stirred. Not anger, not even vengeance, precision. This was only the first strike, a seed of discomfort, a whisper sown into their routines. They would begin to doubt. Question. Fear. And when people fear the truth, they cling to the lie that comforted them longest. Soon, Leonard would need to make a choice, confront the ghost he created, or let her write the ending without him. That night, I walked through the empty corridors, a black notebook in one hand, and a folded list in the other. I checked a name, not crossed out, not yet, but marked. Whitmore, cracked, not broken. Harrow, weak spine, crumbles under pressure. Kroll, breathing harder, not yet bleeding. System fracturing, me still silent. For now, I slipped the list into a hidden slot behind the headmaster's portrait. One of the frames I knew contained a loose backing. Let him find it. Let him know. This was not revenge. This was restoration. And I had just knocked on the gates. Next time, I would walk through. Some stories are meant to be read once. Others wait years, decades unopened, unread, until the right pair of eyes finds them. And some return. Not through bookstores or stages, but through whispers, through absence, through the slow unraveling of a single lie. It began with a package, small, plain, wrapped in brown craft paper and bound with string. No return address, no stamp, no explanation. It arrived on the desk of a junior editor at Stone and Vale Publishing, the very house that had once released The Silent Mirror, Leonard Kroll's acclaimed debut novel. The receptionist assumed it was a manuscript submission. The intern thought it was a prank, but the editor, Elise Montgomery, recognized the handwriting on the label. She had seen it once before, 7 years ago, scrawled across a coffee-stained manuscript submitted by an unknown 22-year-old girl named Ava Marin. She opened the package. Inside was the manuscript. The original, yellowed with age, margins filled with notes in blue ink, some crossed out, some circled, and one, on the title page, for every girl who was told to stay quiet. There was no demand letter, no contact number, just a second sheet of paper neatly folded that read, "Compare it." The ripple began quietly. Elise brought the manuscript to the editorial board. The board, cautious but curious, compared it line by line. Paragraphs matched, scenes mirrored, voice identical. But the name? Leonard Kroll on one cover, Ava Marin on the other. The storm didn't come all at once, not yet, but the sky darkened, and in publishing, darkness means delay. Suddenly, the gala-ray release of the silent mirror meant to mark its 10th anniversary was quietly put under internal review. Promotional materials were pulled. The press kit vanished from the company website. Leonard's publicist received no call. But Leonard? He received silence, and it terrified him more than outrage. At Belgrave, he began to unravel. I watched it happen. The way one watches ice melt slowly, unstoppably. He grew short with staff, paranoid, distracted, canceled 2 faculty meetings, locked his office even during school hours. The once impeccable man began to wear his tie slightly off-center, his eyes sunken with insomnia. The students noticed. The whispers grew, and amidst it all, I remained silent, present, patient, because I hadn't signed that manuscript with a name. I had simply let the truth walk in through the front door and sit quietly in their hands. And for people like Leonard, there is nothing more dangerous than silence they can't control. That evening, I opened my black notebook to a fresh page, stage to complete. Below it, I wrote a question not for others, but for myself. What happens when your story begins to speak louder than you? I didn't know the answer yet, but I would, because the book had returned, not to reclaim a name, but to unmask the man who took it. For years, Leonard wore his charm like armor. It glimmered at fundraisers. It dazzled parents. It bent board meetings to his will. But armor only protects what isn't already cracked. And now, I saw it splintering. It started with a staff-wide memo, cold, abrupt, written not in his usual eloquent prose, but with clipped sentences and too many capital letters. Any dissemination of unauthorized documents pertaining to school personnel or past events will be considered a violation of your contract. No signature, no greeting, no grace. The man, who once hosted morning tea with handwritten thank you notes, had begun to speak in all caps threats, and everyone noticed. Teachers read the message with raised brows and lowered voices. Some laughed nervously, others deleted it without a word. But behind every screen, one question pulsed louder than ever. Who was he afraid of? Later that day, I passed him in the corridor. He stopped. It was the first time in 7 years that he looked directly at me. There was no recognition in his eyes, only suspicion. As if he sensed something was wrong, but couldn't yet name the shape of it. Ava, he said, voice even. I paused, turned slowly. Yes, headmaster. His eyes narrowed just slightly. There it was. That flicker, that fear. Strange weather we've been having, he said, almost casually. I met his gaze. Storms always come after long silences. Then I smiled, just enough, and walked away. That night, when the school emptied and the library lights dimmed to their soft nocturnal glow, I returned to the archive room, but the door was ajar. I froze. And no one had access to this room. No one but me. I stepped inside, slow, silent. The light was on. The wall of files was untouched, but on the central table lay a single sheet of paper, unfolded, waiting. I approached cautiously, typed in block letters, center aligned. I know who you are. I know what you've done, and I want something in return. Below it, a phone number, burner, untraceable. No name, just a symbol at the bottom corner, hand drawn, a chess piece. The night, for a long moment, I stood there, heart slow but heavy. This wasn't Leonard. He didn't deal in riddles. His weapon was erasure, not implication. This was someone else, someone who had been watching me as I watched them, someone who had stayed silent longer than I had, and now, they wanted to be heard. I burned the note, memorized the number, flushed the ashes down the library sink, but the symbol, that stayed. I had seen it before. Not in emails, not in files. In books. In one particular copy of the silent mirror, stored in the faculty lounge shelf, marked in pencil, on page 147, margin. Right, a small crooked knight. Back then, I thought it was doodle from a bored student. Now I wasn't so sure. I returned to the archive room, the place beneath the library. Carved from my silence and rage, I spread the invitation on the table beside the photo wall, then pulled out a thin red string. With a pin, I connected the gala date to Leonard's photograph. The line intersected for others. Nina Prescott, a former bursary student expelled without warning. Mrs. Whitmore, close to Leonard, known for altering records. Dr. Hale, the IT director who had once bragged that no file in the school system could be deleted without his notice. All of them, tied, complicit, or silent, just like I had been. But I wasn't silent anymore. That afternoon, I began to shift the pieces. First, the archives. Belgrave kept a digital backup of every expulsion letter, faculty email, and student record. Most were buried deep behind firewalls coded under fake tags, but I had been here long enough to learn the language of their secrets. I accessed the folder labeled Founders Alumni Reports. Buried inside was the original manuscript, mine, untouched since 2016, and there it was, my name, on the first page, by Ava Marin, the version Leonard never showed the world. I copied it twice, once on a flash drive, once printed on thick, cream paper, the same paper the publishing house used for his edition. I placed it into a plain black folder. No logo, no name. It was ready. Next, the dress. No one had seen me outside of gray cardigans and practical skirts. Invisible clothes. Clothes that whispered, "Don't notice me." But for the gala, I opened a wooden chest in my apartment I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a black gown, long sleeves, high collar, fabric that moved like water. It had belonged to my mother. She never wore it, said it was too bold, too sharp. A dress for women who have something to prove, she'd said once. Perfect. 3 days before the gala, I received another envelope. This one wasn't gold. It was white, unmarked. Inside, a single typed sentence. I know who you are. Meet me in the East Wing stairwell, midnight. No name, no signature, but the paper smelled faintly of roses. Mrs. Whitmore. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because the past, at last, had turned its head. They had noticed me, and now, I was ready for them to listen. Chapter 4. The stairwell meeting. There's a kind of silence that belongs only to midnight, the kind that doesn't just muffle sound but seems to press against your skin, wrapping around your breath like fog made of memory and dread. I moved down the East Wing corridor with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing faintly off the marble floor like a whisper from a time I'd tried to forget. The light here was dimmer than the rest of the school, older. Bulbs perhaps, or perhaps this part of Belgrave simply remembered more than it was willing to reveal. The portraits on the walls, all former headmasters and benefactors, seemed to watch me with their painted eyes, as if amused by the thought that the ghost in the library had finally stepped into the open. The staircase loomed at the end, narrow, coiled, and half forgotten. It had once led to the observatory tower, long since sealed, the door at the top now bolted with rust and time. Students never came here, staff rarely did. That was why she'd chosen it. I arrived before her, and I waited. Not nervously, not anxiously, but with the stillness of someone who had waited years for the night the wind would change direction. When she came, her heels made no sound. A surprise. Mrs. Whitmore had always carried herself with theatrical weight, the kind of presence that announces itself a second before entering the room. But tonight, she moved like a shadow trained to slip between cracks. She didn't greet me. She simply stood on the landing above, looking down, her expression unreadable in the half-light. I knew it, she said, voice low and almost reverent. The day you walked into the staff room, silent, eyes like winter. I told Leonard, she reminds me of someone, but he never listens. I didn't reply. I let her speak. It was safer that way. Let people fill the silence, and they'll reveal more than they ever intended. I read the manuscript, she continued, descending one step at a time. The original one, the one with your name on it. You think it's hidden, but you forget some of us still remember how to read between the lines. She paused on the final step. I level now, close enough that I could smell the faintest hint of rose and gin. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, but I'm glad you are. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with things unspoken, betrayals too old to name, secrets too dangerous to say aloud. I finally spoke, the first words I'd said to her in 7 years. You knew. Back then. She flinched. Slightly. I suspected, she admitted. But suspicion is a dangerous thing in this place. You learn quickly that knowing the truth and surviving the truth are not the same. Her voice cracked, then not with emotion, but exhaustion. The kind of fatigue that settles in the bones of people who have carried too much for too long. I kept quiet because I thought I was protecting myself, my job, my daughter's tuition. You understand that, don't you? I did, I said calmly. Once. She looked down, shame flickering across her carefully powdered face. Then she reached into her coat and handed me a flash drive, small, silver, unmarked. There are emails, she said. From Leonard. About Nina. About others. You're not the only story he's stolen. My fingers brushed the drive. Cold. Weightless. But it felt heavier than anything I'd carried in years. Why now? I asked. Why give this to me? Her voice trembled, but her words were sharp. Because silence was a shield. And now, it feels like a cage. I thought you were a ghost, but you're not. You're the reckoning. For a moment, the only sound was the wind brushing against the stained glass window behind us, rattling it like a breath held too long. Then she turned to go, her final words a whisper trailing in the dark. Be careful, Ava. They will kill the story before they let it be told. I stood alone again, the flash drive in my palm like a fuse waiting to be lit. Above me, the sealed observatory door creaked faintly in the cold, and below, somewhere deep in the core of Belgrave, the foundation began to tremble, not with noise, not with force, but with truth, truth that could no longer be buried, because the girl in the library's shadows had stepped into the light, and this time, I would not disappear. Belgrave's staff room always smelled like burnt coffee and stale pride. It was a place of curated smiles, folded newspapers, and conversations built not on honesty but on performance, where each sentence was trimmed, calculated, dipped in politeness, and then left to rot in the corners of people's eyes. I rarely entered. The library was quiet, predictable. This room was not, but today, I stepped in quietly, deliberately holding a stack of books I had no intention of shelving. I wasn't here to speak. I was here to listen. And if Belgrave had taught me anything, it was this. Walls may be built of stone, but the real cracks are always between words. At first, no one noticed me. Mrs. Whitmore was by the window, swirling her tea with exaggerated calm, the kind that betrays tension beneath its porcelain surface. Mr. Harrow, the history teacher with a fondness for young interns and inappropriate jokes, was talking too loudly, laughing too hard at something no one else found funny. 2 junior staff hovered near the coffee machine, whispering like pigeons near a storm. It took less than a minute. She's changed, one of them said. A young literature assistant, Miss Doyle knew, impressionable, still foolish enough to trust her instinct. Have you noticed? Who? Harrow asked, already uninterested. The librarian. Ava. The room dipped. She's been acting different lately. The other day, I saw her in the server room, alone. Why would a librarian need server access? A pause. She shouldn't even have clearance for that, said Whitmore too quickly. Then realizing her tone, she added, I mean, unless she's been given temporary admin rights. For cataloging purposes. Her voice wavered at the end. Guilt always did that. It frayed the last syllables like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. I stood by the bookshelf, pretending to organize faculty biographies. My back turned but my senses stretched taut like wires waiting for voltage. She gives me the chills, someone whispered. She doesn't talk. She just watches. She's been here for years. Do we even know anything about her? I heard she used to be someone else. That line lingered, not because it was wrong, but because it was true. I had been someone else. Once, I was fire and hunger, pen and passion. A young woman who thought the world could be rewritten through honesty and brilliance. But that version of me had been suffocated under contracts, betrayal, and a stolen name. What stood in this room now was not Ava Marin, the forgotten writer. What stood here was a new version, sharpened in silence, forged in humiliation, armored by years of pretending not to exist. And they were starting to see her. That, more than anything, was dangerous. Mrs. Whitmore caught my gaze, just for a moment. A flicker. We said nothing, but her eyes said what her mouth could not. They're watching. Be careful. I nodded, barely perceptible. Enough. The performance resumed. Laughter returned to lips. Teacups clinked again. The machine hissed steam into cheap mugs, but a fracture had formed. Small, hairline, but real. They had begun to whisper, and once people start whispering, they forget how quickly whispers turn into questions, and questions turn into fire. They thought I was mute, they thought I was broken. What they never realized was that I was watching. Always. They said the library was the quietest place in Belgrave Academy. What they didn't know was that the silence wasn't just from the rows of old books, the heavy velvet curtains, or the oak floors that muffled footsteps. It came from me. I moved like a whisper present but unseen, eyes lowered, lips sealed. Students walked past me as if I were part of the furniture. Teachers nodded politely without ever meeting my eyes. And the headmaster, Leonard Crowell, never once said my name aloud, not since the day I returned. But I remembered his name, every syllable, every lie behind it. Every time he'd said, "Trust me," I remembered the cold ink on the contract he forged. I remembered the book, the one I wrote. And I remembered the silence I chose, not because I couldn't speak, but because silence was safer. The library was both my sanctuary and my prison. From the tall stained glass windows, sunlight spilled onto the old mahogany tables, drawing pale golden patterns that flickered like ghosts across the floor. Students came and went laughing, murmuring, typing on sleek school-issued tablets, but none of them saw me watching. That was my gift, invisibility. The kind that comes not from hiding, but from being ignored for so long, the world forgets you ever had a voice. I took notes in a small black leather notebook. The pages were worn, filled with my neat handwriting in blue ink. Every overheard conversation, every whispered threat between students, every flippant remark from teachers behind closed doors. I wasn't eavesdropping out of curiosity. I was collecting patterns, recording weaknesses. Waiting. It had been 7 years since I returned to Belgrave, not as the rising young novelist I once dreamed of becoming, but as the woman they thought they had broken. 7 years since my manuscript was stolen. 7 years since Leonard Crowell published my story under his name. 7 years since I disappeared from the literary world and reappeared as the silent librarian, right under his nose. No one knew, not the staff, not the students, not even him. He thought I was dead, or perhaps worse, forgotten. But I had spent those 7 years building more than shelves. I had been building a fortress of words. I had memorized every system, every password, every crack in the school's digital archives. I knew which students were cruel, which teachers looked away, which families paid to keep their secrets buried. Belgrave was not a school. It was a machine, polished on the outside, rusted within. And I had the blueprint. At 7:42 a.m., the main door creaked open, and a sharp gust of cold wind entered the library. I didn't look up. I knew that gate, heels clicking too quickly on the floor, the faint smell of roses mixed with nicotine. "Still here, Ava?" It was Mrs. Whitmore, the English literature teacher. She dropped a stack of overdue books on the return desk with a dismissive thud. I gave a gentle nod. She narrowed her eyes slightly, clearly expecting a smile, or a greeting, or at least a thank you, but I simply picked up the books and walked to the return shelf. Quiet, efficient, forgettable. As I walked away, I heard her mutter, "She gives me the creeps." Like she's always listening. She wasn't wrong. Beneath the archives no student ever touched was a locked room. Few knew it existed. Fewer still had the key. It was mine, my memory bank, my war room, lined with filing cabinets, handwritten notes, photocopies of school records, newspaper clippings. On the wall hung a large board blank to anyone else's eyes. But to me, it told a story: scandals, expulsions, cover-ups, and at the center of it all, Leonard Crowell, headmaster, thief, liar. I stared at a photograph pinned to the board, a younger Leonard smiling into cameras at a book launch, holding a novel he didn't write, my novel. Then my eyes shifted to the calendar beside it. A red circle marked a date, now only 8 weeks away, Founders Day Gala. The one day the press, trustees, alumni, everyone would be watching, the perfect day to be heard. I closed my notebook, walked back into the hush of the library, and resumed my place behind the desk. But this time, my silence was not surrender. It was strategy, because soon they would all hear me. There are 2 kinds of theft in this world. One takes your possessions, the other takes your name. Mine was Stolen in ink.it happened on a rainy afternoon, the kind that makes London feel like it's drowning. I was 22, barefoot in a tiny flat that smelled like coffee and ambition. The manuscript sat on the table, my story, my first novel. I'd poured my youth into it, stitched my memories between paragraphs, folded my grief between the lines, and I gave it naively, trustingly to the man I loved, Leonard Crowell. Back then, he wasn't a headmaster. He was a visiting lecturer, magnetic and cruel in the way only charming men can afford to be. He said he believed in my voice, that the world needed to hear it, that he'd help me edit it, pitch it, guide me through publishing. I believed him. I believed every word. 3 months later, the book was released. It bore his name, not mine. He called it a misunderstanding, said the publisher had rushed it, that he'd fix it, that my name would be on the next edition. There was no next edition. Instead, there were interviews, his face on magazine covers, his words twisting my sentences, his eyes looking straight into the camera as if he had lived what I wrote. He smiled, with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had silenced the only witness, and perhaps he had, because I didn't fight. I disappeared. I spent 3 years off the grid. I burned every copy of the book I'd owned, changed cities, cut TIs, took odd jobs, cafes, antique shops, even a mortuary once. Places where no one asked questions, where silence was currency. The world moved on. He rose. I sank. But grief has a strange metabolism. It doesn't disappear. It metabolizes into something colder, sharper. One day I woke up and realized I didn't want justice. I wanted the truth to scream louder than his lies. That's when I found Belgrave Academy. Again. By then, Leonard had become headmaster, a prestigious position. The same man who plagiarized a girl's soul now taught about integrity in morning assemblies. The irony tasted bitter, but I was done swallowing bitterness. So I applied, not as a teacher, not as a writer. As a librarian. It was poetic, really. The girl whose voice had been stolen would now live among stories but remain silent. Let him believe I was dead. Let him believe he'd won. In silence, I began again. The first year was the hardest. Faces blurred together. Students dismissed me. Teachers overlooked me. I smiled, nodded, and took note of everything. The school was rotten under its polished shell. Abuse rumors buried under donations. Expulsion records rewritten. Scholarships denied quietly to make room for legacy students. And through it all, Leonard ruled with grace and lies. But I watched, and I waited, and in the 4th winter, something changed. A girl, Nina Prescott, age 16, came to the library late one evening. Her eyes were red. Her sleeves were long enough to hide bruises. She sat at the corner table and opened a book she didn't read. Just sat there, still, fragile. I didn't speak, but I slid a different book across the table to her. One about a girl who survived. No words, just pages. The next day she came back, and the next. Eventually, she smiled at me. That was when I realized this wasn't just about my revenge. It was about the voices still being silenced. I had become one of them, but I would be the last. A week ago, Nina stopped coming. Then came the whisper. She had withdrawn from school, no reason given. That's when I knew it was time. The book gala was approaching. The press would be there, donors, former students, the perfect stage, and in the middle of it, I would return her book, my book. But this time, the author's name would be mine. There are days that pass like falling leaves, quiet, unnoticed, blending into the decay of routine. And then there are days that slice through the stillness like glass. This morning was the latter. The envelope came in gold, not printed, embossed. My name, handwritten in black calligraphy, stood stark against the shimmer. Miss Ava Marin, Senior Librarian, Belgrave Academy. Not to whom it may concern, not library staff. They knew exactly who I was, or rather, who I appeared to be. Inside was the invitation I had waited 7 years to receive. The Belgrave Founders' Day Gala, a celebration of legacy and literature. Held in the Grand Hall. Formal attire. Press attendance confirmed. Special speech by Headmaster Leonard Crowell. And here it was, the unveiling of a new edition of his best-selling novel, my novel. I stared at the invitation for a long time, not out of shock, out of strategy. This was the stage, the moment, the place where every mask they wore would melt beneath the heat of their own arrogance. Leonard didn't know I was alive, didn't know I was here, but someone did. Someone wanted me, present. That detail changed everything.